Cultural safety and retention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. More than 100 Australian boarding schools have significant numbers of Indigenous boarding students. There's been a 53% increase in the number of Indigenous students in boarding schools since 2015, although this has been affected to some extent by COVID. Indigenous students travel from remote communities and rural areas to boarding in every state and territory in Australia. And there are regular good news stories in regional newspapers and national newspapers about boarding students supported by scholarships. But it isn't always positive. One study of 100 students from one Northern Territory community found that 59% dropped out of boarding in their first year. The majority dropped out in years 7 and 8 and never returned to education. Many of these young people were traumatised by their experience. These young people described coming home and having a real sense of grief, a sense of failure, a sense that there was no hope for the future. Even students remaining in boarding in one study reported being in a constant state of renegotiating their sense of self with the expectations of two disparate worlds, their home communities and the school community. O'Brien said this: "Whether it's the loss of connection to home, the loss of language, culture and identity, whether it's loneliness, homesickness or culture shock, the impact of antecedent or previous trauma, racism or the pressure to succeed, the psychic turmoil occasioned by feeling lost between these two worlds, the intersection of all or any of these factors, for some young people it's just too much." A disturbing number of participants reported that they had attempted suicide or had entertained suicidal thoughts. So, it's critically important that boarding providers who intentionally enrol groups of Indigenous students employ culturally safe practices. So what is cultural safety? It's an environment that's spiritually, socially, emotionally safe, as well as physically safe for people, where there's no assault, no challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. It's about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge, and an experience of learning together. To build and maintain cultural safety in boarding, we need this: to establish culturally safe principles and guidelines that are relevant to working with Indigenous young people, to inform what we do by evidence and current best practice, to apply these principles where possible at the individual, boarding practice and organisational levels, to investigate any breaches and resolve them in a timely manner. So that's how we can build and maintain cultural safety in boarding. The extent to which the benefits of boarding are realised for Indigenous students increases with their retention in boarding. So what we're saying here is there are benefits in boarding for Indigenous students, but the extent to which these actually occur depends on how long they stay in boarding. And this depends on the student's home community, their personal health and well-being, their personal resilience, but it also depends on the boarding provider's ability to create a culturally safe, nurturing, engaging environment while students balance the complicated challenges of living in two worlds. Boarding schools and residences must be accountable to communities and parents. They must implement boarding standards and cultural safety standards. They must regularly monitor their practice with external appraisals and effective self-assessment processes. So how do we create a culturally safe, nurturing, engaging environment that will retain students? There are 10 strategies that can help us do this. Number 1, boarding is appropriately staffed. Number 2, boarding acknowledges and preserves cultural identity. Number 3, physical environment is culturally welcoming. Number 4, students are prepared and assisted with transition. Number 5, appropriate recruitment and selection practices. Number 6, long-term partnerships with parents and communities. Number 7, boarding is appropriately funded. Number 8, education deficits are specifically targeted. Number 9, staff understand and acknowledge the impact of colonialisation. Number 10, other practical considerations. So let's unpack these. Let's have a look at number 1. Boarding is appropriately staffed and able to support student health and well-being. To address the health gap and to meet the complex student needs, you do need lower student staff ratios. And the Queensland Independent Education Consultative Group recommended that this should be between 8:1 to 10:1. So 8 students to 1 staff member, or up to 10 students for 1 staff member. That was their recommendation, and that recommendation has been around for some years. Culturally appropriate, qualified health and support personnel, health and well-being screening, trauma-informed support and pastoral care right across the whole residence, qualified and culturally sensitive Indigenous staff to provide a sense of cultural safety. So having those Indigenous staff members there that will provide that sense of cultural safety. When moving away from family, most Indigenous students need more, not less, social support as they contend with culturally unfamiliar and a difficult educational experience. So they need more support. Number 2, boarding acknowledges and preserves cultural identity. This means that boarding is welcoming and inclusive for Indigenous young people, that there is a critical mass of Indigenous students and Indigenous staff members to help prevent homesickness, cultural isolation and culture shock, so that there's enough students so students don't feel lonely. So imagine remote students coming down from a community up north to a school in Melbourne or Sydney where there may only be 1 or 2 Indigenous students in the whole school. They're going to feel lonely and isolated. So you need that critical mass of students. Has a strength-based approach. So looking for the young person's strengths, their abilities, the positives. This is more respectful and more effective than a negative deficit type approach. Staff understand the cultural landscape of their students, and this is going to take time and effort. So it's going to involve conversations with the young person, conversations with the community and parents, visiting communities, learning as much as they can about the cultural landscape of their students. The residence invests in Indigenous consultation and feedback. So they're getting Indigenous people in, consulting, getting feedback from Indigenous people. This is interesting that one of the main influencing factors on Indigenous students staying on to year 11 and 12 was found to be a school environment that acknowledged and sought to preserve cultural identity and treated Indigenous students with respect. So that's interesting, isn't it? One of the main influencing factors on Indigenous students staying on to year 11 and 12. Number 3, the resident's physical environment is culturally welcoming. So this means Indigenous flags, artwork, artefacts, so that when you walk in, you'll see Indigenous artwork, you'll see artefacts, and it'll just be an environment that an Indigenous person, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander young person will feel comfortable with. It's nice to have open natural gardens and surroundings, to have conversation spaces such as yarning circles, fire pits, to have displayed Aboriginal languages, and to have an acknowledgement of the traditional owners. So an explanation of who the traditional owners are, and an acknowledgement of the traditional owners on a plaque or a poster on the property. Number 4, students are prepared and assisted with transition, and this is very important because this is a difficult part of the whole process. Students transitioning from what they're very comfortable with in remote communities down to something that could be very different for them. So to have cultural brokers and transition support to manage the transition to boarding, and these days we have community support officers, we have transition support unit and transition support service in the Northern Territory and Queensland, And so that is a very positive change to support the transition of young people to boarding. There should be safe travel plans, case management for students with high needs, risks, health conditions, and safety plans that have a trauma-informed approach. Number 5, the recruitment and selection practices, and this is about the recruitment and selection of students, boarders. Effective recruitment practices set the foundation for student retention. So if you want the students to remain, if you want to retain students, then it goes back to effective recruitment practices. And part of this is intentional, long-term relationships with communities, parents and guardians. Careful, effective screening of students so that you can match the student with the school's capacity to meet their needs. An effective recruitment plan will include a recruitment team, a recruitment footprint, or this is communities that you're focusing on, training of the personnel, a recruitment procedure, and a relationship with the stakeholders. Many remote students could benefit by having a halfway step, so something like a community-based boarding first, or visits to boarding first before transitioning to an out-of-community boarding program. There is, of course, the transitional boarding model called MITS in Melbourne, a very effective way of transitioning boarding students to boarding providers in Melbourne. So students come into MITS for a year and then they transition on to other boarding providers. You could select or stream some students for staged entry to appropriate residences. So you might bring a student down for a short period of time and then have them back in the community, then a longer time and then a bit longer again, so that there's a staged entry for some students. Number 6. This is very important, that boarding providers have this effective long-term partnership with parents and communities. Many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents find school alienating and very far removed from their everyday lives. A culturally secure environment requires a staff team that has inclusive, positive relationships with parents and communities. A staff team where every member of staff values cultural identity, cultural connection, and this includes the management, the board, the principal, the head of boarding, etc. A staff team that has a culture of openness and two-way communication. A staff team that has Indigenous staff members on it and culturally aware staff who connect and relate to students. A staff team that has the IT type assistance for families and communities to use this IT to connect with their children, via something like Zoom or Skype. A staff team that has consultation with the communities about student absences for funerals, ceremonies, sport, etc. And also a staff team that communicates with parents regularly, not just when there is an issue, but to let parents know about the positives as well. A staff team that has consultation with communities about staff absences for funerals, etc. A staff team that has regular cultural awareness visits to communities by resident staff, and a staff team that has early intervention and good communication with parents to prevent student suspension. Number 7, boarding is appropriately funded. Boarding should be appropriately funded for Indigenous young people, and it hasn't always been. All the factors that follow in this video have significant funding implications. So the first of these is a lower student-staff ratio. So ratios as low as 8 to 1, 8 students to 1 staff member, up to 10 students to 1 staff member. Dedicated funding for health and well-being. So something like an on-site nurse, other professional support, health screening facilities, and education and support in nutrition, mental health, and personal development. Few providers can afford this level of support without being adequately funded. Funding for the Indigenous boarding staff recruitment, training, induction and cultural awarenesses. Some advances have been made over recent years, however the number of Indigenous people employed in student boarding is still significantly low across Australia. Raising the professionalism and the qualifications of boarding staff, a strategy to target staff who have expertise, enthusiasm and the capacity to work in a culturally safe manner. Staff receive cultural training, incentives and opportunity for interaction with Indigenous communities. Number 8, education deficits are specifically targeted and students are given learning support. Schools have ESL or ESD and specialist remediation programs. Residences have tutoring, homework programs and support programs, and we've just seen how effective this can be in supporting the learning that occurs in school. Vocational options, career guidance and work experience are a priority. And as a quote, "The difficulty for many Indigenous young people in making a commitment to learning is that there is often no clear relationship between formal schooling and employment." Number 9, the residence understands and acknowledges the impact of colonisation and history on Indigenous people and their lives. The history of the residents, communities, people and families is understood, and one way to do this is through a timeline. We've seen some of these timelines. The bottom one is on Tiwi Island, top one is in Kununurra, there's one at Cap School in Coolgardie. These are very effective ways of showing the history of major events for Indigenous people. Correct and culturally appropriate terminology is used. Number 10 are just other practical considerations. Consultation with other boarding providers with experience when providing new facilities or remodelling old infrastructure, for example, room sizes, outdoor areas, staff quarters, security, etc. There is some cultural awareness of preferred foods and menu choices. Students are given input and involved in menu choices. There's opportunities to get out into the natural environment, camping, fishing, cultural experiences and celebrations. It must be an engaging program. There's been problems around smoking and young Indigenous people expelled or suspended for smoking when everything else they do is very positive. So students are provided with options to quit smoking and not suspended as a first option. Streamlined ab-study processes. And so we know this has improved a lot, but more parent-friendly, flexible processes with creative solutions to combat the obstacles that people face. We've come to the end of this video, but there is an activity task. You'll see down the bottom 2 columns of all the factors that increase cultural safety and retention of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Choose 5 of these and show how they could be further developed in your boarding residence. Thank you.